Okay, we are recording. It's close enough to 11:45. We'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank your interest. Thank you for your interest in supporting our native wildlife. This presentation is being made possible through a collaborative effort between South Florida Association of Environmental Professionals and UF-IPIS, who is providing this facility for us. This webinar is being recorded. All the audio from this room will be picked up, as well as any comments made from people on the webinar. If you're here in the building, you need to use the restrooms. They're right outside to the left. You're allowed to eat in here, but if you do eat, make sure you clean up everything you bring in, please. A little bit about South Florida Association of Environmental Professionals. If you want to find out more about them, you can go to the website, www.sfap.org. We're an organization of environmental professionals for South Florida, from Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, Monroe counties. We have regular events like this where we disseminate information about the environmental profession, and we get together regularly for other events. We have adopted islands in Biscayne Bay, the Sandspur Islands. We go out there quarterly for cleanups. We have also are establishing a onshore coral nursery so our members can do research on corals, and then we'll be using the corals to outplant in the wild. And we have started a community oyster garden. First culch bag has been deployed in Dania Cutoff Canal, and we're hoping that succeeds to replace some of the last oyster beds here in Broward County. Next year, the National Association of Environmental Professionals is having their annual conference here in Broward County. We hope to have a track on this subject of importance of native wildlife to native importance of native vegetation to native wildlife. We'll have to see how much interest there is, but hopefully that will happen to continue with the efforts we've been investing in today. Anyways, a little bit about myself, and then we'll have the panelists introduce themselves. I'm the Environmental Program Manager at Port Everglades, which is a Broward County department. I have a bachelor's in zoology, a master's in marine biology, focusing on fish and wildlife. I'm also a certified arborist, certified ecologist, certified fisheries professional, certified wildlife biologist, and professional wetland scientist. I really enjoy this stuff, and that's one of the reasons we are having this meeting today. I'm very passionate about the importance of our native vegetation to protect our native wildlife. And let's go through the panelists. Mark, are you available to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Mark Hostetler. I'm a professor in the Department of Wildlife, Ecology, and Conservation at the University of Florida, currently up in Gainesville. I'm an urban ecologist for over 20 years now. I've been working with a number of decision makers, collaborators on how we can design and manage cities to conserve biodiversity and wildlife habitat.
Okay, and Richard?
I'm Richard Brownscombe, and I'm president of the Broward chapter of the Broward Society. And we have speakers and field trips each month, except for the summer. And we're take a responsibility to look after the natural areas in the county of Broward.
Okay. Jimmy?
And I'm Jimmy Lange. I'm the lead botanist with the South Florida Conservation Program from Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. I mainly focus on mapping and monitoring and guiding management activities for rare plant species around South Florida and parts of the Caribbean. And I've recently started working with Broward County on a contract with the county, so I've been kind of inventorying and mapping rare plants and trying to design conservation projects for the next couple years here. I'm also here today as the chair of the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, and I'll be talking a little bit about the missions of FLEPSI today.
Hi, I'm Courtney Angelo. I'm with Broward County Parks and Recreation. I have a PhD in botany with an emphasis in ecology and conservation biology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm a botanist and an invasive species biologist, and I've been working in this field for about 15 years.
Carolyn, can you unmute?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Mitchell. I'm with WSP, and I'm a landscape architect. I have a bachelor's in botany and a master's in landscape architecture, and I've been practicing landscape architecture for close to 30 years and focusing on conservation, environmental restoration, and also integrating natural systems into urban environments.
Very good. And Cammie?
Cammie Donaldson. Have been active in Florida's native plant movement for over 30 years, the last 25 of which I have devoted to trying to grow the native plant industry in Florida. I'm the executive director of the Florida Association of Native Nurseries and the Native Plant Horticulture Foundation.
Maena? You don't have to get back into it.
My name is Maena Angelotti. I work with NatureScape Broward in the Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division. Prior to working here, I worked as a wildlife ecologist with the Bureau of Land Management in Jackson, Mississippi, and with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm a graduate of UMass Amherst and UF.
Okay, Mark, you're up next.
All right. Well, good. It's fun to see a little screen and hear the voices in the background. I assume Erik will have a chance later on to discuss some things. So I'll just launch into my kind of spiel for the next 10 minutes. Is that correct, Erik? 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So to give you a little more background, I was thinking about what to present today, and sometimes ecology is translated into the design professional world as large patches connected by corridors, which is important for a lot of species. I mean, we think of panthers and bears and some larger species that need these large patches, and even a few birds. But what I think gets lost in the translation is that even fragmented areas, urban matrices, rural areas with some native vegetation and some human-dominated landscapes can provide a wide variety of habitat for a wide variety of species. And so I'm not going to talk so much, with the caveat being these little fragments of remnants that are left in the landscape as being important. Natives contribute a whole lot to this, and I'm not going to touch on that. I'm going to leave that to the other presenters. But what I am going to talk about is a new synthesis and new tool that we designed just for this occasion for birds, and we're talking about forest birds here. And so a graduate student, Yan, and I, a couple years ago, scoured the literature with the idea of saying, okay, which birds are out there across North America that use fragments in and around cities, in rural areas, whether they breed there, and also importantly, whether they use it as stopover habitat. There was no synthesis of this type, and this was our first attempt to really kind of get a list of species that use fragmented areas and even residential areas with tree canopy cover. So once we had done this, I'll give you a little more information about what we did, is we created an online evaluation tool. And the idea here is for landscape architects, for planners, for decision makers. If cities are expanding or if they want to retrofit areas, how do different designs impact different species? So that slide that you're looking at right now, if you had, let's say, a few acres to conserve or to restore, if you did it in small bits, such as little 5 acres, or you did one large one, a 15-acre or more, and did it in some smaller 5-acre plots, which species are you impacting, and how could you improve the habitat for, say, resident species that occur year-round or migrants? So if you click to the next slide. So this tool is online. The URL is a little long, I know, at the top, but if you just Google building for birds and UF IFAS, it will take you there. And the whole idea of this tool is to all that information that we synthesize is presented in a fashion that people can do kind of like on the back of a paper napkin, some analysis to see how design impacts different species. So that's the URL. I would appreciate feedback from folks if they do use it. We're trying to see how it fits in with planning the design of cities and around cities. Okay, go ahead, Erik. So when we first started doing this, we started very complicated. As an ecologist, I got into the weeds pretty quickly here. But luckily, we had on our team some designers and planners that said, no, we need really simple inputs with simple metrics. And so what was the inputs is two things. If you're looking at a human-dominated landscape and you're trying to think how you're going to design it, you just enter the patches, what we call conserved late and early successional forests. And late successional forest, essentially if you walk and you see canopy above you. Early successional, you don't see that canopy. Think woodpeckers versus woodpeckers in these type of habitat. So that's one input is the patch sizes, and the second input there, if you can click, is just tree canopy cover in the built areas. So if you're thinking residential or commercial, it takes a lot to conserve the trees in there, but it does have an important impact for bird habitat. And when I talk about bird habitat today, there's also a whole suite of other species you can think in terms of insects and smaller critters that can traverse these landscapes or live in individual patches. All right, go ahead and click. So there's 5 steps to this. The tool is one to register the site that you're looking at. Maybe it's a 100-acre plot or a 50-acre plot. And then you will enter how much is going to be conserved with one design versus another. And then you'll get scores based on what we call stopover habitat, migrants that are passing through the area or during the spring and fall migration. And then also you get scores for breeding habitat. So if you click on the next slide. And these scores will give you kind of like a range from, very little habitat to a lot of habitat. And you can imagine, I didn't have time to go into detail about this, but you can imagine how those scores will shift depending on what patches of habitat are conserved. And what we found is that there's over 200 species, and I suspect much more because there's a lot of literature, empirical research that's missing, particularly out west, of birds that use some fashion. So whether they're using it as a stopover site or as a breeding site, we broke down the bird list that accompanies your habitat scores that you can get from this online tool. So if you focus your attention on the ruby-throated hummingbird, it gets checks all across the board. It breeds in the forest fragment. It uses it during migration. And it actually breeds in residential areas and does a stopover in residential areas. And this is all from empirical research. And of course, anecdotally, people know that ruby-throated are around quite often. But let's look at some of the more problematic species, like a black and white warbler. This is a neotropical migrant. It travels long distances. It does not breed in Florida. It breeds what we call an interior forest specialist. And so the empirical research demonstrated, it's not going to do too well in the forest fragment. It needs a larger continuous patch of forest. However, during migration season, if there are any birders in the audience, during the fall or spring, you can see these birds migrating north or migrating south, and you can find them in small fragments. So you can provide critical stopover habitat for these migrants in and around cities. And if you look at the far right there, it says stopover in residential areas. It has a question mark. And the reason we did this is that we were conservative with the study. It is now published in Landscape and Urban Planning. You can get the synthesis. If anybody's interested, I can give you a copy of the paper. And in the residential areas, we found 1 or 2 papers but not 3 that indicated the black and white warbler uses residential areas with tree canopy as stopover sites. So we just put a question mark there. If you look at the yellow warbler down there, this bird list, you can imagine this is a section of 215 birds, all forest birds. We didn't do the large raptors, but all passerine, woodpeckers, and another family. You can see a blank there. That means there was no literature on the yellow warbler, whether it breeds in forest fragments or breeds in residential areas. However, we did find them in stopover papers, and they do use forest fragments as stopover areas. Again, a question mark for the residential area. We're just being conservative, but there's some indication that even this species will also use residential areas with trees as stopover habitat. And I can't emphasize more sort of that message that we have to think beyond large patches and corridors and think about the human-dominated systems and how there's quite a variety of species that use this for breeding or for migrating or for wintering. And in particular, there's more and more research that's coming out, and recently I just read an article about how during climate change, these urban, rural, human-dominated systems, if they provide enough structure and habitat, they can promote movement of animals across the landscape. They might not breed in the area, but they give enough connectivity to move animals as climate changes and habitats are changing. So if you want to go to the last slide, I think. So I know I kept it short. The only caveat is, yeah, fragments are important. Tree canopy cover is important, but there is research out there. If anybody's interested, I can give you the reports about how natives promote better bird habitat and wildlife habitat for our native species. So not every fragment is equal. And then also you can think in terms of management of the matrix around these fragments. And there's a lot of impact from inputs in the yard, what people decide to plant, how it escapes into the fragmented areas. So I guess my other take-home message, besides that fragments matter, is that the matrix matters that surrounds these habitats. You can provide more habitat within residential areas for these birds. And in fact, I have a graduate student looking at this right now, how the birds move out of these forest fragments and forage in residential areas. But also you can think in terms of minimizing impacts. So if invasives are in the yards, they will spread into the forests, nearby forested areas. Or if you put too much fertilizer or irrigate too much, all those nutrients can go into nearby riparian areas or wetland areas. If you want more information about this, I didn't have time to talk about that. This one course it's a design manual for cities and for landscape architects and developers about how you conserve biodiversity during subdivision development. I can send that to you. There's my email, and I think I'm right at 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Next, we have Richard.
Okay.
Let's pass this down as far as we can.
I'm just going to use a broad brush to try to describe the past and current status of native plants in Broward County. After World War II, Broward had about 730 recorded native plant species. Today we have about 620. Local extinction is at about 15%. Only recently, cooperation between Broward County's environmental program, the Institute for Regional Conservation, and Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens refocused on identifying rare plants in Broward and their locations. The bad news is the speed of local extinction. It's mostly due to habitat loss and the smothering by invasive species. Our native species now live on small or relatively small properties, often with fundamental hydrologic changes, drainage. The good news is that this effort to identify rare species is finding species that we never knew we had in Broward, and that's very, very exciting and helpful. And the big picture is interesting and not especially intuitive. So I think before this slide, yep. That 200 native species out of that roughly 700 live in the Everglades management areas, all those hundreds of square acres out there. 500 live on the coastal berm there in the populated area. In our natural parks and preserves. So that means our natural parks and preserves that sometimes look like overgrown lots or pockets of trees behind chain link fences contain our legacy of critically imperiled, rare, and endangered species. Almost inevitably, you live and work near some of these places. There are unusual and fascinating plants and wildlife there. They contain the last populations of species in Broward. Every natural area is important and different. I have referred to them as the outdoor rooms of a living natural history museum. They are not yet known for their importance or properly respected. You can see why from this historical map, the next one. The Coral Ridge, where we build, because generally speaking it's higher and drier, and that's where the habitat diversity was greatest. And you can see the percentages remaining. There are a couple pointed out there with the red arrows, that we ignored all the living species except ourselves, a behavior that has to change if they and we are to survive. Today, only 3.3% is left of the coral ridge. Coastal ridge is what I'm trying to say. These are the natural areas that hold our native plant and wildlife legacy. Right here, within our densely populated area, behind the warehouses and in residential neighborhoods. Because the land for nature is now so limited, restoration and native landscaping are important. Just in terms of food supply for indigenous and migrating birds, for example, there isn't enough native source food. Why is native food important? Native plants are the nutritional foundation, the chemistry for living and growing wildlife. It's housing, natural areas are space, and privacy for shy wildlife. Broward has been above sea level for perhaps 80,000 years, with slowly changing climate over thousands and tens of thousands of years, and slowly changing habitat. Coevolution over long periods of time creates interactions between plants and plants, animals and animals, plants and animals. Prey-predator symbiosis mutualism become highly complex and sometimes highly specific. The public has some understanding of plant-specific butterfly hosts. Birds, too, may require specific insects for the necessary nutrition for young. All these interactions are highly complex, happening 1 million times over in an ecosystem and a habitat. And it's happening with microbial interactions, too. It's also poorly studied, certainly here in Broward and here in urban Broward, where the action is, we are the human species. So we, the human species, need to do what does not come easily to us and be humble about what we know and what we do. I advocate using science, but in the absence of information about natural areas in urban Broward, we also need to use common sense. And here are 5 things I recommend. Just plant natives. Plants are food supply. Don't fuss the public about what and how. Just applaud when native plants are used. Restoration is different. Be more careful about species and local source material for restoration work. Education and sophistication is good, and it takes time. For the public, just plant natives. Number 2, use diversity. Because of ecological complexity, plant a diversity of species. Variety is where all the interest is, and what's unusual or ignored is likely to be helpful and perhaps essential for all we know. Plant a diversity of native species. Number 3, finding specific species or a diversity of native species is hard. Okay, so it's hard. Finding rare baseball cards is hard too. Just do it. It's worthwhile. Take what's available. That's easy. Or be persistent. It is a public service when you start creating a demand for diverse species. Number 4, native nurseries are like craft breweries. Everything good about them is local. They can locally source plants and may find what you need. They are quirky. They are all natural and organic. Big boxes can't do that, source locally. If you support local nurseries as much as local breweries, they too will one day collectively outsell the big boys. Buy local. Number 5, know what is locally native. Restoration work and grade A landscaping can find species native to a site by using the Institute for Regional Conservation, regionalconservation.org. It is comprehensive, about 1,500 South Florida native species, and more accurate and more specific about plant range for South Florida than the USF Atlas for Vascular Plants. And it has a subset database called Natives for Your Neighborhood with cultivation information for over 400 species. It also has our natural areas and exactly the plants that are in them. Email me for help. Go to kunti.org for my email, for a list of native nurseries, for a recent article about the local extinction crisis in Broward, kunti.org. Our behavior, so you can go on, there's some of the endemic species. There are, of course, many more. Next slide. Oh, my. Plant and animal interactions. Next slide. There's the article. Next slide. There we go. Our behavior that has to change if we and other species are to survive. We are wonderful, even beautiful. Don't hate yourself or your species, but we have to change this thing about us, that we don't love other species as much as we love ourselves. Here is an image for that. Misty Copeland dancing harmlessly, beautifully above a field of sunflowers. Create your own images. Get the word out.
Courtney, you're up next.
Thanks, Richard, for that great introduction into Broward's flora. I wanted to go through some of the challenges that we have in defining, obtaining, and identifying Broward's flora. So at a landscape scale, Broward County has some unique challenges determining which species are native to the county. There are more than 120 species with disjunct populations across the Tri-County area, so Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, with species in Broward County not being vouchered or documented. In addition to those species, there are also species that have their northern limits terminate in Miami-Dade or their southern limits terminate in Palm Beach County. And all of these species combined make up Broward's dark diversity, or species that are absent from the county but are found in surrounding counties and have the potential to inhabit areas in Broward County. And as a land manager, I have to evaluate Broward's dark diversity and determine if calling these species native is appropriate for the county. Next slide, please. So there are many explanations for why we see these patterns across our landscape. I'm just going to highlight a few. Richard spoke of the habitat loss that has occurred in Broward County. Only 3% of our natural areas still exist in eastern Broward County. You also have to look at the life cycle of a plant can be a contributing factor in why we see these patterns. Ephemeral species may not be detected in surveys. For instance, the sand dune spur, you can see on the ISB map, it is not vouchered for the county, but recently Jimmy Lange and I found it at Mezzo Johnson State Park. But it's an annual species, so it might have just been overlooked in the past. Next slide, please. Other explanations could be that the species was extirpated before it was vouchered for the county. We have historical accounts of the clamshell orchid being in the county, but we have recently gone out and looked for it and have not been able to find it to document it for the county. Species can also have rare populations and may not be detected unless you're specifically looking for them. And also, it's pretty well known that there was a lack of exploration in Broward County during the early plant explorations in this area. A lot of explorers wanted to get down to Miami-Dade and Monroe counties to explore, and so Broward wasn't documented as much as those other counties. And also, there was also loss of botanical documentation. Some of Leitner's vouchers were lost during his explorations. Next slide, please. So that's looking at a broad scale and the challenges that I go through trying to define native species in the landscape. But when we go into the marketplaces, there's also other challenges that we face. And in Broward County's park system, we are constantly installing new landscapes or creating gardens for the public's benefit, but also for the benefit of wildlife. And we are trying to create these landscapes based on plant communities found in the area. But when you go into the marketplace, there are challenges because sometimes non-native species look like native species, or they're being sold as native species. The firebush is a hot topic. There's two varieties. There's a native variety and a non-native variety that look very similar. And a lot of times the non-native variety is sold as the native variety, or even when you request it for a specific project, you are brought the non-native in lieu of the native. And this has been widely discussed, and yet there are still challenges with this when requesting this plant for native landscaping. Next slide, please. Another native species that we have this issue with is the native porterweed. So there's a non-native in the same genus that is on the FLEPC list, and there's also a hybrid of the native and non-native that are in the marketplace. And despite having different growth habits, the non-native a lot of times is sold as the native species. And because of this, we're currently not allowing the species to be planted in our park system. Next slide, please. And then there's also challenges identifying native species due to taxonomic changes. So there's kind of a complex story going on with the Zamia. So the scientific community has updated our native coontie as Zamia integrifolia, but still in the marketplace it is labeled as Zamia pumila. but beyond that challenge, you would seem to think that you could just like exchange the names, but Zamia pumila is actually referred to as a complex, and there are many different species that were once represented by this one name. And also this species is highly associated with Native Americans and was moved around Florida and the Caribbean before modern accounts. So the genetic integrity of this species may have already been distorted and convoluted before this name change. So I actually reached out to a researcher at the Montgomery Botanical Center down in Miami to ask him about this Zamia issue. And so the Zamia pumila, the strictest sense or the purest form of this species, is found in the Dominican Republic. And he didn't think that there was like a high chance that we would actually find this species in the nursery trade in Florida. So an easy solution to this issue with identifying this species in the marketplace would be having an expert or a professional go into the marketplace using the morphological characteristics that define Zamia integrifolia, identify the individuals that reflect these traits, and then ask the nursery industry to update the name change. So that's a quick and easy solution for this species. Next slide, please. Another challenge that Richard also spoke about is obtaining these native species and issues with supply and demand, and possibly issues with availability of local seed resources. So as I said, we try to create landscapes that have native species that are diverse, that offer a wide range of ecosystem services for our park services. And with that, we want to have as many possibilities available to us as possible. And I also quickly went on the IRC's Natives for Your Neighborhood website and just kind of scanned to see, how many natives are available to plant around my office, which is in Oakland Park. And there was a long list of natives that popped up, potential natives for our area. But when you go in and try to find these natives, that same number is not reflected in the marketplace. So I want to pose the question, how do we create a greater demand for more natives in the marketplace, and how do we support our native nurseries so they can create this diversity that we are looking for? That's it. Thank you.
Jim?
And I'll give you a little air click when I need to advance the slide. Does that seem reasonable? Okay, so I was actually going to start with, I can start with the Connect to Protect. Okay, so my brilliant colleagues had a lot of great plant knowledge to share. So I'm going to kind of focus on some of the programs that the organizations I'm a part of are working on. First of which is Fairchild's Connect to Protect program. And I think this is something that can spark some of these conversations and is doing part of this job of creating demand, particularly in Miami-Dade. So the Connect to Protect network is basically a network of native gardeners. We're trying to provide education and citizen science, and we're focusing in the pine rockland ecosystem of Miami-Dade. Next. I need to focus on it. So the pine rocklands are a globally critically imperiled plant community with a single species overstory, very diverse understory of herbaceous plants and graminoids. And so when folks come to Fairchild and they sign up for the Connect Protect network, we start them, and this can be, we can do private homeowners, get a starter kit and a sign, typically 5 plants. If you make a donation, they can get more plants. And businesses and schools can get up to 10 plants. And they also then become part of the monthly e-newsletters, and they get these invitations to participate in field trips and work days and other things that we do as part of Fairchild. And so this is a map of the pine rockland ecosystem. We currently have 600 homes and 100 schools. And this number is slightly old, so it's probably a little bit more now. And here's just a map of what's left of the fragmented habitat. The big green blob in the middle are the rocklands around Zoo Miami. And so here is a map of all of the homes and businesses. So, we're trying to do this job of, what Mark talked about, establishing these stepping stone gardens and corridors throughout the urban landscape. So our main goals are, we want to promote pine rockland plants in the community. As I said, we want to create this connection through stepping stone gardens. But our main focus is educating residents about native diversity and getting people excited about it. And some of this is a public relations battle. And so, maybe once more, yeah. So this is a battle against the steady supply of cheap non-native plants, the big box stores, monocultures, lawn chemical treadmills, as we call it. And so we want to show people that native plants can be beautiful. We think diversity is beautiful. So this is a picture taken in Lange at Everglades National Park, and few people would argue this is a beautiful landscape, but how can we show the public that, your native yard can also be beautiful? So one of the ways we did that is we had a photography contest of Connect to Protect Gardens, and these were some of the winners from 2018, and these were shared online through social media, and when people sign up, we show them this is, these are some examples of what your yard could look like. And so basically, the current network, because we're focused on the system in Miami-Dade, it's open to Miami-Dade and Monroe County residents. And all they have to do is kind of send us an email, and they stop by the nursery and pick up plants. And so it's just some of the key points of this program, and I think what make it unique and special. Some of the concerns about native plants and getting more native plants into the system are kind of who's going to harvest them from the wild. So in this case, we have trained biologists from Fairchild who work closely with land managers who are going out and harvesting the seed, following guidelines from the Center for Plant Conservation. This ensures proper identification and provenance of the plants, so you know what you're getting, you know where it's from, and it prevents over-harvesting. But then following that, sharing is encouraged in our network. Once people have the plants in the community, we don't pretend to have any kind of ownership over them. We encourage people to share these plants and get them out there and get them around. And our more passionate members, when people are like, oh, we got this starter kit, we love it, how do we get more? We refer them to native nurseries, and we work with native nurseries in Miami-Dade, and I think this is part of that, increasing demand that the program can provide. Also, one of the big things about it is it's free. People are really into, I'll plant native if you'll give me free stuff. All I have to do is show up. But that creates some of the issues of how do we increase this. So currently this program is funded through money from Section 6 of the Endangered Species Act that kind of gets channeled through the Florida Forest Service and into the Department of Agriculture, and then to us for a rare plant conservation program. So this was kind of under the guise of, we're protecting a habitat that is home to many rare plants. So, through outreach and education, we're kind of indirectly, conserving our plants. But it is indirect. So money from this grant system, we would love to spend it on actual work with rare plant species. So we're really focusing on how we can increase the scale of this project. And hopefully we can discuss some of these things today. I'll skip the acknowledgments. There's a lot of great people. That's another aspect of Connect to Protect that's important, is we have a lot of volunteers. Not a lot of organizations can necessarily pull this off. Fairchild has a huge volunteer base. So I'll jump over to FLEPC, and I'll try to do this quickly. A lot of people don't know what FLEPC is. They know we're the people who make the list. We have Category 1 and Category 2 invasive species. Category 1 being the ones that have demonstrated, to do ecological damage in our natural areas. Category 2 being things that seem to be spreading but maybe haven't caused that same degree of damage yet. But beyond that, the vision of FLEPC is to be a leading resource and partner for advancing invasive plant management in Florida, and our mission is to reduce the impacts of invasive plants through the exchange of scientific, educational, and technical information. So each year, so basically what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is just talk about how how FLEPC can perhaps help some of you in the room, but also how you can help FLEPC and the fight against invasive plants. So each year we have an annual conference. Oh, sorry, not yet. Each year we have an annual conference. It's in April. Next year it's going to be in Daytona. It's a great way to get CEUs. We have a lot of great speakers. This past April was all about bridging the gaps between invasive plant science and management. So we're trying to connect people on the ground spraying invasive plants to people in universities doing the research. We also have a grant program for our SISMAs. So these are cooperative invasive species management areas. So each year we get a pool of applicants from each SISMA, and so we try to fund work that they're doing. We have an education grant. These are usually small grants, but these are little things that can get a sign printed or little things like that hopefully can help spread the word about invasive plants. We also have a research grant where we fund 1 to 2 depending on the applicants each year. These are usually graduate students, sometimes undergrad, where we help pay for some of their research costs. And this is an aspect that I worked this year on petitioning 6 species for the state noxious weed list. And this is something that I wanted to bring up. Maybe not a lot of people know this. Anyone can do this through the Department of Agriculture website. If there's a species that you just think needs to be taken off the market and you have good reason and good data to back it up, you can go on the Department of Agriculture website and petition to get these species listed and taken off the market. So this can be a very important step that literally anyone can make, but not a lot of people know the way to do it, to go about it. But there's on the Department of Agriculture website, if you go to the noxious weed page, there it'll kind of guide you step by step through the process. FLEPC also does a lot of outreach. I won't focus on that so much. And then the plant list. Each year we added 2 new species this past year and kind of increased one from category 2 to category 1. But this is another thing that I think folks don't understand necessarily the process. It kind of happens behind closed doors, but this is a process that we want to make very transparent, and we want everyone in the community to be involved in. Everyone in FLEPC are kind of volunteers doing this in their spare time. So also on the FLEPC webpage, you can submit criteria sheets. So a lot of people will have an invasive plant. They're like, oh, it's not listed yet. Why not? Perhaps folks in FLEPC don't know about it, or just no one's had the time to put together a sheet. So you can go on the FLEPC webpage, and again, there will be a sheet, step-by-step process of how you can get a plant proposed to where the plant list committee can then review it and get that plant added to the list. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Okay, well, wonderful. First, I just want to say a big thank you to Courtney and Jimmy and Richard. Everything you said about supporting our nurseries, we really appreciate it. We love you and thank you for the great work that you're doing. I was asked to address 3 questions. The first question was, what are the challenges that a commercial grower faces in producing native plants? And the very first challenge is simply knowledge of the product. And I think we've heard a lot today about the complexities of knowing what's native and what's not, and where it's native and what it does. And plant ID, while there are many plants that are very easy to identify at a glance, there are also many which are quite tricky to identify. And that knowledge is not a typical part of the educational background of many commercial growers, although in the native plant industry we try to pride ourselves on having folks that very often do have a stronger biological or ecological background and pay attention to plant ID. But throughout the horticulture industry, there is a great need for, I say this all the time, I wish that horticulturists would give more attention and have more opportunity to ingest ecological knowledge, and on the ecology side, we need to perhaps grant a little bit of respect to the role of horticulture in the production and sale of plants in a world of humans who care about what things look like and are less informed about what things do. What is important about native plants? Yes, it's important that they be beautiful, and many of them are, and we don't actually understand how to see that yet. But what's most important is what they do. Nothing is more important for preserving wildlife than providing habitat, and habitat demands native plants. So knowledge of the product, education of the industry is very important, and our association focuses on that. And we are in our infancy. The native plant industry in Florida is less than 50 years old as any kind of organized entity. And in fact, believe it or not, we're actually ahead of the rest of the country in some respects in that regard. I tell people all the time, I loved Richard's, I love his reference to the craft breweries. I like that. I often tell people, think of organic and healthy and local food and where that was in the 60s. People started to be interested in health and environment and started to really push it. But I know when I got out of college, we had a little local community co-op where you could go to the cafe and, get a healthy local organic thing. And it was really kind of horrible. We ate it because it was good for us and it was good for the cause. But it was a pile of brown rice and steamed veggies and soy sauce, and it just wasn't appetizing. And think how that has changed. Now you can go into any grocery store and there's an enormous selection of things, and some of them are really very attractive, some of them are very expensive, some are not. There's, some of things are really good, some are not. There's a lot more out there. That all came through organized, repetitive, persistent, passionate campaigns for education and awareness, both within the food industry and for the public, and the same has to be done for our horticulture industry. Getting seeds and plants, oh my goodness, such a difficult thing. And of course, in the horticulture industry, guess what? Most plants are not produced from seed, not on the big scale. Most of them are from cuttings, Getting seed is very, very difficult. Where are you going to get that seed? Not out of a state park, maybe out of a national park, maybe out of a county park. How much are you going to get? Who's going to identify it? Thank goodness Fairchild's got biologists involved in their seed collection, and that's exactly what we need. But it's difficult. Where are you going to get that seed? How are you going to maintain genetic diversity over time in the nursery, where a typical practice is to have these mother plants that are producing things, Well, over time you need to change that up to keep the diversity going. Then the whole idea of provenance, our folks joke about the 50-miler club. As a customer, you want this plant to have come from seed that was responsibly sourced within 50 miles of, where you're using it. Well, no one is set up in the industry to track that. And the food industry is struggling with that right now. Even the marijuana folks, who are the only people that have enough money to deal with this, are struggling with provenance of their buds or whatever it is. But to scale, to have an operation be able to say, this is where the seed came from, and this is the Lange starter plant that it produced, and this was stepped up to a 1 gallon, and that was stepped up to a 3 gallon, and that was grown into, and it was shipped over here. It would take years to develop that. Not that we shouldn't have that, but it's enormous. The requirement in time and staff and dollars and infrastructure to do that is enormous. And only large operations would be able to begin to do that today, and large operations will not respond until the demand is there. And the small little local nurseries that Richard referred to that you should cultivate can do that on a small scale, but then they can't scale up supply beyond the individual's yard. So there's all those difficulties. And many people are not aware that in the horticulture industry, it's like other aspects. There's a chain. Almost typically there's a chain of people involved. It's very rare, except at the smallest scale, for the person who is selling you the plant to be the same person who collected the seed and grew it up from the seed to the finished plant. You know, if you're growing trees or shrubs or other things, there have been many people involved, many different companies all along the way. Even within the native plant industry in Florida, we have people that buy starter plants and seed from other states and then grow them up and then ship them out again. A plant could be much better traveled than you by the time it gets to where it's installed. Impacts on the supply, I mean, yes, there's the issue of weather, like hurricanes, Erik asked about, and of course that's been very recent with Irma, has been very disruptive, but that's true with any agricultural entity. Climate change, we have no idea what that's going to throw our way, but we have certainly already been observing it. Growers in Florida's native plant industry have steadily observed how plants, particularly along the coast, are climbing up and the changes, and it's affecting rainfall, which in a lot of our smaller operations, which are not greenhouses, that's a big deal. The economy for horticulture is probably, for ornamental plant horticulture, the economy maybe is the biggest thing. We're the last product to go in the ground. This is true whether it's native or not. If you're developing, boy, there's a need for everything, but the plants are the last thing that's needed, and when the budget goes bust, that's it. And when the economy crashes, we're the first thing to get cut, too. So, you know, everybody's already talking about, ooh, 2021, what's going to be? Let's sell all the plants we can now, grow like crazy, you know. I mean, when had the big financial crisis in 2008, ooh, that cleaned out the nursery industry in Florida. Huge numbers of nurseries disappeared. We grow a perishable product. We can't keep it sitting there until you're ready to plant it. All of those issues, you know, you can't afford to keep stepping up. I've talked to people who are horrified to find out that growers burn trees that can't be sold because they can't afford to do otherwise. It is horrible. But those are impacts on supply, much of which we don't have a whole lot of control over. What do we have control over, and how are we adapting to the need? The demand is increasing every year. I've been in this since '96, and every year it's a little better. The demand is more and more and more with the steady education, and now the crisis facing us of our climate changing. We have an extinction crisis. People are getting more educated about the connection between plants and animals and the connection between our natural world and ourselves. So the demand is increasing, but it's inconsistent and it's soft. It's not enough to convince big growers, and it's not enough to keep a small grower growing. So it's difficult. And again, this is farming. And in South Florida, it's hot farming. It's hot, dirty work, and there's all those challenges. But it's all about demand. And I think programs like the Connect to Protect, things like this, all these things have been suggested are good. From a landscape perspective, what we need are excellent examples. We have, is it Charlotte, or the landscape architect? Carolyn, excuse me, I know it's a C name. Carolyn, landscape architect on the line. Landscape architects and designers are so important to bring that design perspective. Again, the plants can do everything in the world, but they still need to look good. And of course, there's the full range of aesthetics. Some of us like purple hair and tattoos, and some of us are horrified by purple hair and tattoos. And we have to serve that full market. And taste can change over time, but again, that's hard to control. And as we have more plants on the market, that need for education continues to expand. As the palette expands, the education expands. That's again why FAN concentrates on education for our industry. We have an annual event called the Native Plant Show. This year I'm so happy that we're moving into Palm Beach County. We've been in other parts of the state. So we're coming into Southeast Florida where we see a huge interest and need, and an extra poor supply, perhaps, of to meet the need and the interest. So if you go to our website, Florida Native Nurseries, plural, FloridaNativeNurseries.org, it'll lead you to others, it'll lead you to the Native Plant Show, it'll lead you to Plant Real Florida, which is in retail outlets information. We want to grow with you, but it is a difficult industry. It's a difficult industry, and the smaller you are, the more challenging it is, and yet there are also opportunities for the small, tiny operation. So.
Okay, Carolyn, you're up next. You probably need that mute.
Hi there. So I wanted to talk about the perspective of the landscape architect, and Cammie, your talk was an awesome precursor because I have experienced all of those challenges that you have talked about from the customer side. But I wanted to talk about the pre-development part of creating habitat, because I think that the aspect of actually obtaining the plants is well covered by others. So I'm going to focus on some of the challenges or some of the things that shape the way we are able to do habitat creation in urban places. And to do that, I picked out a project from the past that illustrates a few key points. One of the images that you see on the left is a plan that was developed in 2007, so before the devastating housing crisis collapse. And that project was conceived as redeveloping a golf course for housing, and that was a benefit. Golf courses aren't the most biodiverse places, so there was an additional interest in creating a naturescape. So that is the wonderful Broward County program that's implementing Florida's Florida-friendly landscape concepts. And the project in 2007 had 640 dwellings, which in this picture on the left, you can see all the way on the lower left, there's a big apartment building. And by going dense, that allowed a lot of the rest of the area to be not covered with buildings. And then the rest of the project was townhouses. And that allowed the whole site plan to include a lot of landscape. And the landscape included stormwater management ponds that were actually set in the center of a park that was the main attraction in this community that was being planned. And it included clubhouse, tennis courts, swimming pools, pavilions, picnic areas, all sorts of walking paths, playgrounds. So it had a big landscape program. And that supported the demand for a lot of plants. And by going with a naturescape program, the concept was that we would be creating some really, useful habitat. And the total area of the part of the site that was a park was 18 acres. And some of that ability to create, a landscape of that scale and with the intent and the financing to actually plant it out with natives comes from some of the regulations that we're working with, and that is the typical land use regulations that have changed over time so that they are a bit more habitat friendly, although not perfect. So just the density requirement from zoning regulations limits the amount of a patch of land that can be covered with building, and inevitably will result in more pervious area, more area available for planting. Doesn't guarantee that it will be planted in any habitat-friendly way, but it does, create that possibility. A lot of the land use regulations are devoted to stormwater management, and that includes the Florida Friendly Landscape Program, which has really evolved out of the Stormwater Management District's desire to reduce water use and reduce stormwater pollution. There are also regulations that cover traffic that are very detailed in the requirements for safety and for also the impact of traffic on community, the surrounding communities. So all of those regulations really shape what development can be. So to the extent that regulations are making it possible to create habitat, it will become a possibility. One of the regulations that is specifically about tree canopy replacement is an interesting one to think about in terms of habitat creation, because it can be an impediment or a creator of habitat. So the basic purpose of the tree canopy ordinances that have come up in like the last 15 years all over the country is primarily about heat island effects. So it's about the canopy, it's about shade, and it's also about stormwater management. And they're not really about habitat creation. Habitat creation is a side benefit of those. So the ordinances are actually requiring, for example, inch-for-inch replacement of tree canopy if a tree is removed, without regard to the quality of the tree, except that it meets certain size requirements. And that is quite a challenge when your intent is to plant or replace exotic trees with native trees. It's quite a challenge to be able to source the native species in the sizes that are required by these ordinances to accomplish what those ordinances are intended to do, which is to replace that canopy. So those are some of the rules of play when you're trying to create some urban habitat. Programs like the Broward Naturescape, University of Florida resources are, incredible benefits for Florida that aren't really as available in other states. So that's something to be very happy about in Florida, that you have these spectacular resources. And also Fairchild Tropical Garden, other, institutions around South Florida, you really have a lot of resources there. And yet you also have the hurricanes, and that together with the economy is another really important driver, and Cammie touched on that. And the project that you're seeing on the left is the one from 2007, and the one that you're seeing on the right is what happened after the economic bubble burst. The project no longer made any sense as what it was planned as before, which was, meeting the density requirements, but also different kind of housing that would be marketable in the economy. So it took actually quite a long time for the property owner to regroup after the collapse and actually redevelop the site. And what we see on the right is what ended up being built on that site. And if you'll notice, all the way on the right hand side, there are two buildings that are in sort of a parentheses shape. That's where the stormwater pond and most of the open space that was required on the site by the regulations ended up. It's no longer a park with the naturescape concept or any of those other landscape amenities that we talked about. And that was because what made sense economically for the developer was single-family homes. So the upshot is that the development didn't end up with a naturescape. It may be that it could in the future, because some of the, we'll call it the infrastructure for that to happen, is still there. There's still open space. It's still continuous. It's still possible to imagine that site being developed with a little bit more nuance or subtlety in the planting design than what was possible in the ultimate design. But for that to happen, there really would need to be some kind of financial support for that. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges in actually pulling off a habitat creation in a private development project like this, is justifying it financially, and then understanding that there's a significant amount of education that would need to happen with both the developer and the homeowners about the benefits and the maintenance requirements. Most of the benefits of a naturescape have to do with reducing inputs like irrigation and fertilizers and mowing and those kinds of things. So there's a case to be made, but it is a case that does have to be made. You know, there's a sales job that has to happen, and part of the role of landscape architects is making that sales job. And one of the things that makes that sales job much easier is the availability of the plant material. And so it's I guess, Cammie, it's sort of a chicken and an egg kind of thing. And there are, I know of symbiotic relationships between designers and nurseries where the designer is interested in planting native, so the nurseries understand that this is going to be a demand driver, so they see if they can make it available. But that really is about creating a relationship of mutual interest in making that go. So those are just a few thoughts on some of the ways that regulation and the reality of real estate development challenge us to create habitat.
Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. Next we have Maena.
Close enough. So I'm going to begin the way I like to always begin, is where are we right now? Because I think one of the things that we have to think about when we think about planting, what kind of situation, what kind of environment are we in? So this slide right here is just showing that we are a big county, but most of our county is the Everglades or Miccosukee water conservation lands. So it's not somewhere where we're going to be planting unless we're involved with the National Park Service or things like that. So we have a limited space. And this is just, again, to show, in terms of our density, is that when you think about our density, when you take the zero population density, Broward County is even denser than Miami-Dade. So not only are we dense, but we have sea level rise. And I think Cammie touched on that as well. And so these are all going to be drivers when you're thinking about what you're going to plant. And this is the salinity line, which keeps on moving westward. And what you're seeing on this slide is our wells. And why I put this slide in is because that's also going to start driving what we're planting. As we get a more saline environment, there's two factors: the salinity and the ability for the plants to have intermittent inundation. So I really truly believe that while we start planning for our future, and when we're planting, thinking about plants that that have higher salt tolerances, plants that can have intermittent, at least, inundation, are really more of a sustainable planting regime for us.
Did it move?
Yeah. And this is just a fun video I always show because everybody likes videos.
How do I launch it?
And this is, it's fun, but it's sad, right? So this is the fish in the street, right? But again, this is really, to me, the example of Broward. We are the fish in the street.
I see the fish.
This is our future conditions average wet seasons map that just came out. And the two things that are changing on here is our precipitation and the sea level rise. The earlier slide where you saw for 2060 in terms of the sea level rise heights have changed with these maps, and these are fresh off the market, and we have really talented people in our division. So I am by no means saying that this is a naturescape. This is a water resources and everybody else in our very talented EPCRD division. This is a great green infrastructure series map.
Go back to that slide for a second. Just saw it. Thank you. 1 second.
We'll send this whole presentation in about it at once.
Yes. So this is from our talented Katie Lelis in conjunction with, I see, Jill. And this is an award-winning map series. And it's and I think they're going to keep on adding to it as we get more information. And you can talk with Jill afterwards or contact Katie Lelis. But this is really showing the state of our county, and it's really great. I will put a plug in for us. Kim Mayo is in the audience too from Naturescape. We do the certifications. We have a very strong partnership with NWF. And part of that is doing the naturescapes that Carolyn has talked about earlier. So again, this is just a slide showing our naturescape Broward and the tenets of it. The picture in the middle are 2 5-year-olds that helped plant a rain garden at MLK Elementary. So nobody has any excuses. And they were right in there. They had a blast, and so did I. So you're never too young to start. And it took an area that was really an eyesore for elementary school, and now is something beautiful. Some of the solutions that we have on things that people touched about earlier is our habitat connectivity project. That, again, we have with NWF, where we have been planting trees throughout the county based upon low canopy. And that has been very successful. I can't remember if we're on our 3rd or 4th year. It's a lot of planting. We have a lot of calluses. And we do this in schools. We've been doing it in some parks. And it involves a lot of outreach with the community. We also have a very robust outreach program with our pamphlets. I brought some today, and they are award-winning, and they deserve it because we worked really hard improving them, revamping them, and really they touch on some of the things, again, that people talked about. People wanting things to be beautiful. They don't think that they can get a Florida native that is as beautiful. We also talk about that in our naturescape trainings where we say, this is an invasive. Here's the native that looks just like it. So plant this. And we also go over some, of the species. I believe that Carolyn talked about earlier in terms of like the porterweed and the firebush and how to distinguish it because it is rampant. Our issues with native plants. I just recently did the master agreement for our Water Matters Day, and I had a lot of really new plants that we wanted to have and to be seen. And I sent out a request for proposals through our purchasing to over 100 nurseries. We had 2 of them respond to it, and only one of them met the qualifications, and he only bid on maybe half of the plants. So it's a real struggle, and it's really a disconnect that I hope that we can solve and find a way, to work with the nurseries and figure out, was it something that we wrote? Is there a different process that we need to go through in order to get the plants that we would like to start giving out to the community at our events and planting? So that's something I think that we can talk about later. This is another collaboration event that just occurred in January where we worked in our Bureau, Broward Municipal Services District, a disadvantaged area in our communities with 2 schools, Dillard High School and Parkway Middle. And the kids went out and they planted 1,000 plants, native plants, at the bioswale, moved 6 cubic yards of gravel, put in scientific hobo and data loggers and iButtons, and got the kids early. That's one of the things I wanted just to stress is, and I think you've seen it in the pictures, we got to get the kids. I'm tired. I can't plant too many more trees. I can talk about them now, but, and I'm sure Kim can say it too. We're tired. It's hot. So we need to get these kids activated, involved out there. But really start with them and get that ethic right away, because without doing that, we are lost. Here are some other partnerships that we have done. One with Erik at the port, right near the Civic Center. We've done one with Julia, Highway and Bridges. So really, you can click again. Partnerships mean so much and take the burden and makes things so much easier to do, and the ability to get them done. I think this may be my last slide. These are more partnerships, Lee and Doug, with our dune plantings that we do, with our habitat stewards training that we do each year with teachers. We'll be doing this next week, I think in Hollywood. And then at New River Middle School, our marine section is starting work with a living shoreline in the back of New River Middle School. So we just constantly are trying to find new partnerships, new ideas, and really trying to innovate any way we can. So.
Thank you, Maena, and all these presenters. Now, in the notice for the meeting, I proposed a grading system for providing vegetation for native wildlife. This is something I put together. If you hate it, it's my fault. If you like, maybe give a little credit. But let me give you a little bit of background history of where this came from. First of all, the port, one of the reasons we're having this meeting today is I've had significant challenges with landscape architects, not Carolyn, but others, landscapers, in trying to plant native vegetation at the port. We have a policy commitment from our upper management that we're going to optimize habitat value in our green spaces to the maximum extent that we can by planting locally native vegetation. And I try to do that. And landscape architects, unfortunately, keep on pushing non-native vegetation on me. I understand that. Going back a little further, let me explain my background a little bit. I have a master's degree in zoology from the 1980s, before they required that zoologists also take classes in botany. I left school without any knowledge of plants whatsoever. In 1990, I bought my first house. I wasn't working in the environmental field at the time. Went to Fairchild Tropical Gardens, the old Fairchild. I saw these beautiful plants. Going to home improvement stores, every time I'd get a bunch of lumber, I'd grab something that I saw that looked pretty. I was very much a horticulturalist, and I was very proud of everything I had planted in my yard until 1992, when I started working for Dade County Durham, and then I realized that what I was doing was really supporting wildlife, and it changed my perspective completely. I got rid of all my non-natives and planted native, and I've been since then only planting locally native vegetation. But I saw the transition in myself from going from a ornamental horticulturist to someone that was trying to do something additional. And if somebody had approached me when I first planted my house and say, you're doing it all wrong, I probably would have been resistant to somebody telling me what to do on my own property. So what I devised this grading system to try and convey to the landscape architects, to our upper management, to other entities that are trying to push non-natives on us in terms of why we're trying to do it. And I don't want to put anybody on the defensive to say it's absolutely wrong, but by saying that by doing these additional steps, you can really do something positive for the environment, I can say, let's try to get that A+. And I think that that's a good tool for me, hopefully for others, to try to convey the message of the importance of planting locally native vegetation. So this is kind of a draft form. There was one comment that I didn't get implemented in here in the D range. But I'm looking for feedback from you guys. So if you have feedback about this grading system, if you think I should actually dump it for some reason, let me know. If you think it's useful and you have some feedback, please let me know. But this already is a tool that I'm using at the port to try and convey this message to others. So that's what I started with, but we also have a lot of next steps. When I look at everybody in the audience, and I recognize half of you through other environmental programs. A very diverse group here. Not everybody's from SFAP. I see people that I don't recognize with native vegetation shirts on. Thank you. Yeah. So I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir. What we need to do is get the message out to the ornamental horticulturists that there's more to just planting pretty plants in Broward County, where we only have 3% of our original natural area remaining in the upland areas. You know, we can make a difference in the vegetation that's planted in the developed areas. We can create wildlife corridors for different species. We can offset some of the impacts that we've seen. I also wanted to mention, we have stories, success stories, like the Atella butterfly was once not known in Florida at all. And then we started planting the Kunti all over the place. And Kunti, kind of reluctant to give the home improvement stores credit, but Home Depot and other home improvement stores were selling Kunti like crazy at one time. And in 2015, when Broward County did their butterfly count, I believe the Atella was #1 species. I mean, it fluctuates a lot, but by planting that larval host plant, we made a difference in the Atella butterfly. There are other examples with butterflies, and Sandy, I know, is a butterfly expert, so she can correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the species, like the Miami blue butterfly, it's now on the endangered species list. And it's, I don't think, for any other reason than loss of its larval host plant, the gray knickerbean. Gray knickerbean used to occur all the way up the coast to, I think, Indian River County. Brevard County, okay. And for some reason, it's not vouchered in Broward County, so we have that gap. But there are records of the Atella butterfly occurring in northern Dade County, possibly Broward County. And now it's restricted to, I think, just
Miami blue you're talking about.
Yeah, maybe it's down in the Keys somewhere. I forget.
It's offshore to the Marquesas.
Yeah.
That's the only place.
And it's just purely, from what I understand, loss of that gray knickerbean. And it's not that aesthetically pleasing of a plant, but that's an example of something, if we had planted more of, we might have not that loss of that species. Same with the Bertram's hair streak butterfly, with the pineland croton. And but we also have examples of where non-native vegetation is adverse. And there's an article that was put out by the Smithsonian about how the non-native tropical milkweed causes problems with the digestive tract of the monarch butterfly. It's a little complex, but I want to start collecting these examples. And with SFAP, we have a page dedicated to the importance of native vegetation for native wildlife. So if you know examples that we can provide of where a specific species of plants or the loss of those plants is resulting in the loss of wildlife, or examples of where when we not introduce but replace species that had been lost, we see successes like the Atella butterfly. I think those messages are also very important in reaching out to the horticultural community, that these are things we can do to make significant improvements. So let me see where we are in time. We got about 3 minutes. I just want to mention something else regarding vegetation. I used to be a instructor and also on the Board of Governors for the Florida Master Naturalist Program. And so we taught a lot of wildlife classes, and we also set up a citizen scientist bat study project where we were looking at the occupation of man-made structures statewide. And there were some interesting things that I found before I turned the project over to someone else. But for example, the Brazilian free-tailed bat is found throughout Florida, except for Broward, Dade, and Monroe, the Keys part of Monroe County. And I was going to do a geographic GIS analysis to try and figure out what variables there were that might restrict the range, because it's not temperature, because they fly south throughout down to Brazil. I couldn't find any other common variable, but it could be that there is some association needed with some plant that is available here. You know, we have so much to learn about our wildlife and the interactions with the vegetation that before it's too late, we should be pushing to try and provide the habitat that they need, the species that they need, before we have extreme losses. So I know we're kind of short on time. I don't want to let this go too long, but I would like to, on the SFAP website, list the steps that would be good to really make this message worthwhile, to really convey to the ornamental horticulturists that there are opportunities to do more. You can still have landscapes that are aesthetically pleasing and provide habitat for wildlife, support local wildlife within those plantings. So we want to help create a market for local native nurseries. We can use this grading system, or anybody can use this grading system. We can use this discussion from today's forum. The webcast will be available. We have different websites like the Institute for Regional Conservation. Did I get that right? Okay. They have some excellent resources that Richard mentioned. Make those available to people you're trying to convey the message to, and get volunteers to meet and give presentations to some groups. We have a lot of very diverse types of plant groups in South Florida. There is even one that promotes the planting and distribution of exotic species. So, yeah, it's unfortunate, but people, they get attracted to certain things, and there isn't anything wrong with that, unless they're, of course, spreading, class 2 and class 1 species. But we want to get the message out to them. Maybe have the epiphany moment that I had when I started at Durham, realizing that I was doing something wrong and that it can be done better. So all of you in this room have the opportunity to reach out and make those connections with these groups, with the Master Gardener program, with all these specific plant community, plant societies, etc. And also reach out to your local government. Elected officials, the engineering, planning, landscape review staff. I've even had situations where the landscape reviewers are trying to encourage me to plant non-native species instead of native. So those are all opportunities we have. And it is now 1:15, which is when I wanted to close the meeting. So if anybody needs to go for other purposes, please don't feel intimidated about leaving. But what I'd like to do is open it up for some additional discussion. We'll leave the recording on. I'll also open the floor to people that are on the webinar, and we can answer questions, discuss things internally for another 15 minutes or so, and then conclude the recording, and we'll capture that for everybody to use. So let me first turn off the mute for everybody. And if you're on the phone and want to speak, please set your mute now if you have background noise, and then unmute if you want to say something. So, where's the unmute all? And if you're leaving, thank you very much for joining us. Very much appreciated. Oh, the audience is already, I want to unmute. No, they are unmuted. Okay, so if you're in the audience, you can unmute yourself and then speak. But we have a few people that wanted to ask questions, like Doug.
Yeah, what I wanted to do is just tell you, I'm going to send you some links. I actually have material in the car, and I can't believe I didn't bring it in to pass out to National Audubon, Florida, and all the chapters, 45 Audubon chapters in Florida. There's a program that's funded by Audubon Florida through the foundation called Plants for Birds. So what it's all about, when I give you the links on the website, it's all about native plants using zip codes throughout the country to attract birds so that appropriate native plants can be planted. So it all ties in. So I'll send you the links so you can pass it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll include that as well. Does anyone else in the audience here have any points of questions or discussion? Yeah,
speaking to our landscape people, both the planners and our nursery people, Richard, you mentioned that we're kind of preaching to the choir here. One of the biggest problems that I see is landscaping practices that are done by those guys that, they have all the tractors and the clips and everything. Like, I left my apartment complex this morning and I look in the trash and there's, I was throwing out my own trash, that's why I was doing that. And all these clips from the palm trees, the flower, they've cut the flowers off, and cut we talked about the bats lose those fronds as the leaves are down. And so the landscaping practices, this is not Vizcaya. If we want wildlife, we have to allow leaf litter. We have butterflies that the larvae live in the leaf litter. We have, how many of you have seen lightning bugs lately?
Right.
Okay, they live in the leaf litter, so we take everything, we throw it in a plastic bag, we throw it in the trash. They cut off all the vegetation that the animals can eat.
The only way,
them?
the only way for that to happen, though, really, they are doing what they perceive to be the desire of the customer. So ultimately, the public has to rise up and demand no, no, no. And it is a long, I have been screaming about sable palm pruning for 25 years. And in my own town, and I'm like the crazy erratic old woman now coming into the city council, saying, you told me you had a no prune policy and you just pruned, all that. So it's a constant, persistent, it's not a one and done. This is you devote your life to this and you hope the next generation continues it. But we joke about South Florida. I'm in Central Florida. I mean, we joke about this. I actually got this phrase from a designer, a young man, so it's great because he's young and he'll probably do other stuff. And I think he's maybe based in Palm Beach County, and he said, it's the tyranny of the triple layer hedge. And you all South Florida really developed that. You know what I'm talking about, the hedge. But we need to get people to intensely dislike that and say, I don't want that, I want this other. Sometimes a triple layer hedge may be okay. It's amazing what can live in a really densely, hedged up thing. But it's all about the public saying no, and really loudly saying no. I mean, they don't want to have to do that. I mean, okay, people who are not educated, that's part of what's on the industry. And I have some industry people here. What's on the industry is we have to educate our own people to do better. And that's starting to happen. There's across the horticulture industry, whether it's native or not, there's an emphasis on professionalizing the workforce and education and training and learning that, if the hammer, everything's a nail or whatever, all, doing better. But the demand it's all about demand. It's all about demand. So we have to keep educating those things about what lives in the leaf litter and the fact that you just killed 9,000 things with your blower or whatever.
I had somebody one time when I worked over here, literally a bag of Atala and say, I just killed about 10,000 of these because they were all over my plants.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
I have a point I want to make. Maena kind of touched on it a little bit about climate change. As a member of the Climate Change Task Force, there was an interesting presentation made several months ago about the effects of climate change on our water resources and how saltwater intrusion is going to negatively affect our wells. And what I found very interesting is the county still doesn't mandate native species being planted in these large-scale projects. They're still allowing non-native species to be planted. And of course, there's conservation measures that have been in effect for many years, which people don't abide by anymore. They're watering lawns on a continuous basis. I think it's time the county mandates that all future projects are planted with native species to further reduce the demand of potable water, which, by the way, 50% of our potable water goes to irrigation in the state of Florida. So to me, it would seem logical that the county needs to mandate future projects should be native species. It's important that we plant species for habitat, but what it comes down to at the end is money. Money is what rules. And if people have to pay 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the amount of money for the water, ultimately they're going to start cutting back the water. But what are they going to do about landscaping? Well, the landscaping is what's really drawing our water resources down. And if the county mandates that we start to change those parameters and mandate that we put native species in that don't have the same water requirements as lawns and non-native species, I think it needs to come from the head down. Because until that happens, until people pay, they're not going to make changes. They're going to want beautiful things. And if it costs too much money to have those beautiful things, then people are going to start evaluating some let's look at some native species that don't require the water resources that we're putting the high priority right now.
Yeah, I think dealing with politicians is challenging because, you know, they want to represent their constituents, right? And if they perceive that there's, you know, regulation that's going to be ill-received, you know, telling people what they can and cannot do on their property, especially a lot of people are very passionate about their plants, especially when they find focus on one group of plants like palms or bromeliads or something. They don't really want somebody to tell them that what they're doing isn't right. So there are challenges, and a lot of us in this room work for government. I can't go and go to the politicians and promote change. It was really the public, you guys that aren't in the public sector, that need to band together, that need to find a way to connect with the elected officials to encourage them to start proposing legislation that will gradually make those changes. I think it's hard to make drastic changes at one time, but maybe an implementation policy saying, you know, we're going to start in the next 5 years, we're going to maybe start requiring 25% of all landscaping that's planted being native. We probably already have something like that in some municipalities, but it's
Hi, Erik. This is Carolyn. I just wanted to follow up on that thought. There are requirements for native plants in many, if not most, landscape ordinances, and yet it's still hard to. Well, and their percentage is like 40%, so it's not where we might like it to be. But that availability of the native plant material is really the biggest challenge, and regulators aren't going to require all native plants if they simply aren't out there, because it will be unachievable. But public sector clients can, because you have the ability to plan further in advance for a big project, you can do the contract growing, which I think is one of the most important tools that the community has to support local natives. No small business or even large business is going to grow things where they're not guaranteed a sale. And when we have a big project where we have the appropriate planning timeline, we can go ahead and identify what the plants that are needed are going to be, and then create the contract with the grower to supply them. So they're not speculating on whether someone is going to buy their natives. They have a solid government contract to grow this stuff. And I think that's a big, if that became more common with public projects, it would really support the native plant industry and, you know, get the ball rolling a bit more. And I think there's some challenges with your procurement processes where that's often not possible. So just a couple of thoughts on how to make that work.
Okay, Kim, did you want to?
Yeah, I have to say something too about water conservation efforts and not, I think the mandatory restrictions we did probably 9 or 10 years ago for irrigation. And that's countywide by ordinance. So that step has already been taken. But I will tell you with 100% certainty that the majority of residents in Broward County do not know that we have mandatory irrigation, outdoor irrigation restrictions. No clue.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, with what it's in the name.
So Broward County, as far as countywide ordinance, has taken many years ago a big step for mandatory water conservation. Now, if we can get everybody in the county to know about that, that's going to help.
I think enforcement is the only way to do it. There's nobody.
It's impossible.
Well, there's nobody enforcing, but the only way to do it is put a surcharge. You want to use 10 times more water than your neighbor, you're going to pay exponentially higher. And then you're going to see conservation
People
measures
who are
actually.
on wells don't get billed. So there's a lot of people who are on wells.
We need education because enforcement's, you're never going to get the staffing levels.
Never.
The county doesn't want to add positions because it's money to add positions, but education is something that could be done.
Well, the county can't go into 31 different municipalities to enforce it. It's up to the city to enforce it. if they're not good. That's not gonna happen either.
And it results in a lot of public backlash. I mean, education.
It's never gonna happen.
You have to change people's values through education.
Well, and when I was a kid, it was always the paper. The paper, what section you were in, and what day you could water, and what time you could water, and right, exactly. This guy's on social media.
Linda, did you want to say something about the contract plant growing?
We have not used, I'm from Broward County Parks, we haven't used contract growing yet. It's on a direction that I'd like to go in the future, but we're still trying to contract out some of our management efforts, like exotic plant removal and control. So that's one that we're working on right now, but in the future, I'd like to do an agreement with one or many nurseries so that we plan what we'd like to buy, tell them what we're committing to buy, and then even possibly work out if it's an agreement with specific nurseries. I can see that you could have a relationship where they collect seeds under, agreed amount of seeds, agreed amount of plant tissue, and then they can then cultivate that for restoration purposes and landscaping. And perhaps even, it have to be part of the agreement, or perhaps even sell part of that to the public as well. But we can't just open up our natural areas to be harvested, because then we'll be in trouble in the natural areas. If anybody can come in and just start collecting, you're not supposed to collect in natural areas.
I think it would be better if you could have a partnership with like with the Fairchild.
Well, we do actually.
For the seed collection, and then if you could provide seed that the provenance and identity was absolute, we are customers.
Right. Like, we're not able to sell it yet, but we are working with Fairchild. They're coming into the parks, and they're going through and trying to find the rarest plants that we have not been certain are still being preserved in the areas. And some of those plants, if there's enough tissue available, seeds available, they're trying to take that and cultivate it so that we can replant it. So, but that's a very small scale, because there's basically one biologist that we've contracted for 5 years.
Workforce production, more biologists.
I just want to say, for us, we have thought about that, but through our purchasing, it's not something that they think that we were able to do. So I don't know, hopefully in the future.
It would have to be an agreement. It wouldn't be purchasing. It'd have to be like an agreement with an institution, or through an institution, perhaps.
Jill, you had your hand up here.
I did. I wanted to ask Carolyn something, if she's still.
Carolyn, can you hear? Carolyn? She might be muted.
It was regarding the golf course example that she gave me between 2007 and 2015 about what had been planned as far as naturescape and then what actually happened after the crash. And since I do land use review sometimes for the county, I'm interested in the topic and in the way regulation works. It sometimes doesn't work. And I'm wondering if she had any suggestions, if she comes back on later, could respond about what could have been done in that situation, whether the land use amendment that was proposed was just too vague because it was transferring from the golf course, so that single family use was still additional density and qualified. Why was that mixed use high density proposal not the minimum? Is it the impervious percentage that needs to go up? What is it that we don't lose those opportunities? Because I know it's really hard to convince somebody that's already planting, that already loves their garden the way that they have it, to change. But when we have new people coming in, we're providing that environment for them. Why not from the get-go give them what we expect South Florida to be, or to become again? So what are the opportunities in land use regulation to make sure that we don't lose those opportunities again?
Carolyn, are you on the phone still? Or on the webinar?
Yeah, I am, but I didn't quite hear the whole question.
It's a long one.
Golf courses, is it the impervious percentage that we could have raised? Was it the density, the housing? What could we have done to have not lost that opportunity?
Well, so part of that formula was that the, and I only know about what was publicly presented because all of these plans need to be approved by the planning board. So one thing that can happen is having people show up and say, wait a minute, what about the landscape ordinance that requires 40% native plants? and really, doing some advocacy that way. In terms of the regulations, I know the Fort Lauderdale landscape regulation was recently updated. Hollywood's hasn't been updated lately, and just having a look at the landscape ordinance and seeing where it's asking for native plants and what the percentage is, and then actually making the plan reviewers understand that there is a constituency out there that cares about it, and they will show up at public hearings and ask if those requirements are being met.
Thank you.
Yes.
In reference to Carolyn's notation about regulation, replacing trees that even may be tall exotic trees that provide canopy, but we must, in Broward, replace them with 10-foot trees and we cannot even replace them with maybe the same amount of square foot canopy and native growth, because it has to be
you're making that's an excellent point, because that's not the way that ordinance is written. That ordinance is written that you're to replace by a formula, which is pretty typical, but it's enforced with an inch per inch caliper replacement. So all of those landscape ordinance could have a refresh that is tilted more toward habitat. So if the intent of the regulation is to preserve the tree canopy, and there's some method, to comply with it by offering the same amount of canopy and with a variety of sizes of plants.
Yes,
then
instead of 10-foot trees.
12-foot trees, 2-inch diameter at breast height. That's how out of date the Hollywood regulation is. So Fort Lauderdale has actually gone to caliper. But yeah, so looking at those, the landscape ordinances and the tree canopy replacement ordinances and seeing where they could be revised, that's something that, a group could take to their city council and say, what about, looking at this again?
It's my understanding that the City of Hollywood landscape ordinance is currently under revision, so there might be opportunities if you live in the City of Hollywood to make comments like that to the commissioners. And there are challenges, like at the port, we're in 3 municipalities, and we recently, with Carolyn's help, we removed some non-native trees, and we're trying to replace them with assemblages of native plants, kind of mimicking habitat communities. And we got hit with this 2-inch DBH 12-foot tree constraint that eliminated some of the natives that they don't grow that robust. We did get a concession on satin leaf. Satin leaf wasn't really available in 2-inch, but we can get 1.5-inch. After a lot of back and forth, they're allowing us to plant the 1.5-inch and get credit for them toward a total caliper replacement requirement. And again, this is for taking out non-native trees, something that we're trying to do for the betterment of, wildlife. We're in the middle of 3 parks. We have State Park on our east, and we have on our south, and to our west we have Westlake Park, and we're a major corridor for wildlife, and we're trying to optimize habitat value, and we get hit with all these horticultural perspectives and what we should look like, and it's a challenge, and hence we're here.
To add to that challenge is the culture in Tallahassee would like to remove a lot of these local guidelines and local ordinances, and so that adds a different layer to the mix. We may feel one way here in South Florida, but we may be fighting a different perspective coming from Tallahassee. I know that the tree ordinance, the countywide tree ordinance, has gotten weakened recently by a bill signed by the governor that will allow you, if you have a tree on your land and you think it's dangerous, you have an arborist say, if it's your private home, say an arborist says it can come out, it can come out. It doesn't have to go through the mitigation at all for dangerous trees. So that adds a whole other layer. I mean, we may feel like we need stronger, we need to update it, but we're getting a different climate coming, from above, even the local level.
I think South Florida should secede.
Well, but there are a lot of engineers in South
We're
Florida.
Caribbean, we are Caribbean, we are not Central and North Florida. I mean,
Yes.
That's the bottom line.
Maena.
Maena.
You show a lot of pictures of schools that you guys have helped. I didn't see anything in the high schools. We have 5 horticulture programs, 5 in high schools in Broward. They're all very active, and I'm very active with getting the kids certified for horticulture professionals when they graduate. They constantly are growing things and doing. They sell them to get money for classes and to further find podcasts, whatever they want to do. It would be possible for the seed and for you to get to the high schools, explain to them how important it is to have a native landscape, help them grow them so that they can sell them to raise money. And then you're broadening not just the youth that will own homes and go on to do things, but you're also putting native plants in the community at these sales. Because they're always looking for seeds, they're always looking for that. And that's a good education program. We're helping them come out certified, but they need material to grow as well. We put natives in their hands. There are 5 high schools. We've got Plantation, South Plantation, Pearl Springs, MacArthur, and Western. All very large programs.
We've been working with them for 15 years. So we have a school board partnership.
So
we're entering our 3rd year.
So we have a real, so as Kim said, we have a partnership. It's very robust. Not only do we strike the irrigation because they are one of the largest landowners in Broward County, and so I personally go in there and have permission to change it to 2 days a week, and I have been doing that for 6 years. But we also have Victor Suarez goes in, and we know all of the horticultural high schoolers. Vince Newman was just in our one-day naturescape that we had for Everglades, and we know him very well. And we've been trying to work with him, because he does raise a lot of non-natives. And so we have been trying, and I personally have been trying to figure out a way to filter plants to him so that he can grow them, because he says the lament is that he can get them cheap or free from other people to have his kids grow. The whole idea for Water Matters Day, before I even came here, was the idea that the high schools are going to grow the trees. And so really, I mean, we need help with that, clearly. I know that just Court Everglades, I'm going to speak one day with the teachers. Victor has some Bahamacasia trees that he had them grow and gave them away. So we are trying to do that. So there's definite challenges, but I absolutely don't.
You have 2 new teachers too at the Plantation, South Plantation, so they're much more moldable probably than.
But it takes money and it takes donations of it.
And donations are hard. We get requests for donations. We're too small to afford it. That's just the reality of it. If you're a really big grower, and we don't have a lot of really big growers of native plants, you can do it, but it gets really hard. I mean, I'm so envious. There's a collegiate plant initiative thing where they do these fabulous plant drop programs on college campuses to get kids exposed to plants and interested in plants. And growers donate like thousands of plants I'm not real interested in. But anyway, they're plants. I would love to be able to do something like that.
I want to make a
Probably not in my lifetime.
Corporate donations, and they're not coming. They're coming from Home Depot and Lowe's.
This is a great suggestion. Miami-Dade County has contracted with some of the local homeowners who have certain plants like torchwood for the shelf swallowtail. And those homeowners are supplying the seeds for their plants in their gardens, their trees. And that's a suggestion. People who have naturescape homes, have them donate some of their seeds.
Yeah, I think that if there's a will, there's a way, and there's.
Yeah, if you need help, absolutely, because I attend meetings with the school board. That's how we got, it's actually part of the curriculum. Come and be certified now. Yes, we didn't deal with teachers, we went to school. So, work with some of that.
At the Water Matters Day South Plantation Horticultural Program, they had one of the largest booths there. They had 2 booths. And I looked at what they're working with, and I didn't see a single native in there.
Yeah, and that's why I was wondering, because
I don't have to go on.
So we go, and we also, part of our program is planting the gardens. We were the first school district in the county because of our partner, Interstate Partnership, and then they putting the gardens. We put trees, part of the habitat connectivity, and lots of projects that we do are putting the trees into the schools and working with the schools and doing environmental curriculum, not only for the kids, over 50,000 kids have had high school through elementary have been educated on native plants. We do it with the teachers, probably 500 teachers, more than that, custodians as well, because really without them, nothing's going to exist on your lands. But, let's talk afterwards and see if there's something to really kind of get it going. Victor too is, really invested in getting that and figuring out a way. It always becomes down to money.
GLA writes that program.
This is Carolyn. Can I just make one more, or just pass on one more thought, or it's actually a concept, and I think it's helpful in building an industry. In the design world, there's something called a volume specifier, and a volume specifier is some designer or builder or other entity that can be relied on to specify a lot of something, and those volume specifiers get a lot more attention from salespeople and suppliers because they're just a better customer, more reliable. So identifying and making those relationships with volume specifiers, and then a brokerage or some kind of a supply clearinghouse or other kind of service that would allow collectively the Florida native plant industry to fulfill those demands, I think would be helpful. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that even with the best intent, if you can't fulfill the the planting plan that you've put together, and Erik and I just went through this, if you can't fulfill the planting intent because the plants aren't out there, it's embarrassing, and often designers or specifiers aren't going to do it because it's just too risky and too hard to pull off. So things that facilitate the supply and demand relationship can be very helpful, and I have to think it's going to come through identifying those volume specifiers, but also maybe through the Native Nursery Association, some kind of a clearinghouse or something that would help those specifiers actually source plants more easily and more reliably.
I think that working with the kids is so extremely important because especially the high school kids, they're ready to get out, and if they're studying horticulture and they want to advance into that career, that's really the time to.
They're also getting a science credit, so they're different classes are not. It doesn't matter; those kids will still be home. Those kids are still going on to do other things, whether they go to government or whatever. You want to start right there and then get to that brain.
And I'd like to see more native plants and what they're working with, and don't want to take anything away from the Florida native nurseries, but there might be opportunities to do contract growing with some of the high schools.
Oh yeah.
So
we need the next generation, so we'd be very in favor of that.
I actually work pretty closely with South Plantation High School, and I work with their gardens, not with the actual growing of plants, which always horrified me when I would go there for buying plants from nurseries. They have so many native plants on campus. Why are we not teaching them how to be propagators?
great point.
We don't need to buy that material. If you are a nursery, 9 times out of 10, surrounding your property, you have plants that you go to propagate from. Why is the school any different? They have to maintain those gardens. So why aren't they taking the materials from those gardens that they're maintaining and using it in propagation?
Education.
My son's going to the environmental program at South Plant next year, and I'm hoping that he can do some of these things.
We're trying to going to Terra grass.
I'm sorry, South Plantation.
Okay, South Plantation is in Everglades.
Yes, Everglades.
Okay, I always say that's what I'm working with.
Yes.
Okay, with the
like Naturescape with getting the children involved. You're always saying, oh, you wanted young children involved. I have 2 young children at home who are willing to help. They love getting dirty, playing with the dirt and the soil. So I started with little like raised beds, and we had a house, and now they enjoy helping me with container garden. But I can volunteer them.
Well, that's what it takes.
Come with them, 'cause we
Thank you for raising children that like dirt.
Well, we're half an hour over when we intended to end. If you have any additional comments, like I mentioned, SFAP is going to put this up on our website, all the next steps. If you have additional next steps that I'm not able to extract from the audio, please send them to me. We'll populate it with that. But I'm also encouraging anybody else that has websites, social media, any other way of getting this message out to the public to also convey the message. This audio recording, you're welcome to put it up on your website, all the information we have. You know, we don't want to take ownership of it. We just want to make it as available as possible to anybody who has an interest.
You want to give that website again?
It's sfaep.org. So I'm going to stop the recording now. I appreciate everybody that's still online for sticking with us, and all of you for sticking with us as well.
Thank you, Erik.
And thank you, panelists. I think we made a good first step. I mean, not a first step, but a good additional step in the right direction today. Thank you all.
Are you still on your Twitter?
We don't have a lot of Twitter activity.
I was checking yesterday because I saw the meeting on Facebook.